There we go. Okay, we're live. I really should have plugged this in first.
Right, you can adjust it as well so it faces up. If you want the thing to face up, just pinch the two things inside.
Which one to? Oh, that.
Yeah, and then pull, so push it up. Right, and then plug it into charge.
There we go. Okay, we are live on TV, on Facebook, wherever it is.
We're actually live now.
We were live when I was plugging in the phone.
Okay. Good morning.
Funny thing, you should have just never said you were live, and then when he would have gone on for leaving, he wasn't live.
I think that's plugged in. There we go. Feel free to take it away. No, take away Barnby. Take it away.
Okay. Welcome to the Warwick Marxist Society. We do events like this 6 till 7:30 every Thursday. So obviously tonight we'll be doing a talk presented by Woody on what it is to be radical, an investigation on Marx and ethics. Next week, Thomas will be doing it. You, Thomas, next week?
Yeah, it's me.
Yeah. Thomas will be doing a talk on Marxist economics if you're interested in that as well. So take it away, Woody.
Yeah, right. So, like moralism and morality is sort of like a sort of paradox for Marxism, really, because it's presented, or it appears like at first, as a sort of completely amoralist, sort of school of political activity and a theory of society and its historical development. So Marx says in politics that like moralism leads to a sort of like false. It creates a sort of false unity between the two classes which divide society on material grounds, and he sees it as like inevitably leading into a sort of reformism, where the politician like seeks to establish a sort of socialist program, but within like the like without violating the rights or the sort of moral entitlements of the bourgeoisie, without like infringing on their personal entitlements. And in respect to Marxism as a science, like the sort of scientific socialism aspect, he sees it as like completely superfluous. Essentially, he says that it's like using moral concepts in the study of society is sort of like chemists, like using reflecting on the moral properties of molecules. So yeah, he says it's essentially pointless. Like communism is a progression of like the causal processes in history, and it's not a moral ideal to be realised. And he's very critical of past socialists for taking this view that the achievement of a just society and a like moral society is simply a matter of like the moral enlightenment of the working class and the oppressed in society, like the sort of like the self emancipation, self liberation, and yeah, he says that it's a historic process. It's not a matter of like moral principles and ideals, but nonetheless, he makes a lot of normative claims. So a lot of claims that seem to be like value laden, and he obviously takes his study of society to be something that's like wrapped up in his own personal values, and you've got a question like why, like A, he sees communism as like valuable, what value he attaches to it, and B, why he devoted his life and why subsequent like local radical figures decided to devote their life to overcoming capitalism, and I think it's important to look at Marx in the context of moral philosophy and like the history of moral thought, because it tends to like exemplify the ideas that exist in society and are circulated on like a general like daily life level. It sort of takes them and like clarifies them and removes all the like contingencies and like context specific aspects. And essentially like the basis of like the problem brought into moral philosophy in the modern age is the like Hobbes' idea of the individual in society, like in conflict with everyone else. This like idea of the war of all against all. So one of the main problems Hobbes was trying to tackle was how a harmonious society is possible when everyone's, as supposed, motivated by individual interests and inherently in a state of conflict with others because of this. So he says it's just a matter of giving up your freedom to a sort of higher authority, what he calls a sovereign. So repression for the benefit of all, essentially, like giving up your freedom in order to remove this state of conflict. And obviously a lot of people after this were dissatisfied with this conclusion. And there are two main schools of thought from this, the utilitarian school of thought, which thought that proposed that the pursuit of individual interests will inevitably lead to the best outcome for the whole of society. So a harmonious society is simply a matter of everyone fulfilling their own personal desires. And this is essentially the basis of Adam Smith's economic thought. So he thought that in an economy we should seek a state where people are free agents and they're free to establish their own commerce and sell their own products and produce according to their own desires. And he said this will inevitably lead to an efficient economy, which inevitably leads to the best happiness for the most people. And literally this ideal state of a completely maximally happy society. And on the other hand, you have Kantianism, which is sort of his whole idea is that humans have an intrinsic moral duty, and this is what prevents them from falling into chaos with each other. So this is essentially the morality of self-repression. So, obeying this moral law means doing what's right in your society. So Marx essentially he takes a lot from Hegel in this respect, but he really criticises these moral views for generalising a very context-specific and historically specific. He takes out in Hegel of the relationship between members of society shaping their place in the world. So Hegel is very interested in the Roman Empire and how the society. So he's interested in how the relation between a superior, a general or an emperor, over their subjects could distort both people in this relationship. So the subordinate person is inhibited because they don't have the freedom to pursue their own goals and actualize their own ideas of what their life should be. And the ruler in the other respect is inhibited because they have no way of actually defining themselves in relation to something. From a position of power, they're not really accountable to anyone. So there's not that reflexive relationship that you'd have, which he sees as the basis for defining ourselves as human beings. And so Hegel sees the progression of society as sort of the overcoming of this inhibition of humanity, and it's this historical process towards freedom and emancipation of human development is he thought guided by rational principles. So the more people understand, the more free they'll be, essentially. And Marx sort of took this idea and he said it's just not good enough to see this as an intellectual rational process. It must be referred back to the material conditions in which people live. And he sees the ideal endpoint of communism as sort of the dissolution of the relation that's culminated in capitalism between the person who owns the means of production and the worker who has to sell their labour, their time for a certain period. It's devoid of their humanity in that aspect. And he sees this sort of the value of this society in the fact that it can actualise the humanity latent in people. And he sees the appeal to morality and politics as completely unnecessary because he considers this desire already inherent in the working class. So he says it's not a matter of like setting an ideal for people to reach. It's a matter of like freeing them and dissolving these like oppressive bonds in society, which prevent them from actualizing their own desire for like human progress and self-actualization. So essentially, it's less a morality based in these like past moral theories of self-inhibition and respecting other people's like rights. He says that rights are essentially a bourgeois concept because they depend on the ability to enforce them. So it's possible to use rights as an like a moral concept as an instrument against bourgeois power and imperialism, but that's not what they're designed for. They're designed as a sort of way of protecting the individual interests of the appropriators in society, protecting their individual property and their individual like, safety from the masses, which obviously want to conspire against them. So yeah, he's applying this rights-based theory to the general the like mass of humanity really doesn't make sense because it's not designed for the masses. It's designed for the individual. And yeah, what Marx sees is that when we overcome capitalism, when like property is socialized, we will no longer like have this antagonism between individuals because production and life in general is so much more collectively, it's a much more like collectivized, socialized process. So it's just a matter of like overcoming this myth of complete justice and equality in a neoliberal sense, which is fundamentally in reference to the sphere of exchange. So he takes this concept of a complete division between the sphere of exchange, in which people sell products, and or the bourgeois would sell their commodities, and the worker would sell their labour. So people like Adam Smith and modern neoliberal theorists would say that this is a sign of a completely just society if there's no coercion. But what Marx says is that this ignores the other side, which is the sphere of production, in which the whole of society is based on a massive system of exploitation. So yeah, he says like we need to consider both aspects of this, and yeah, the moral ideas underlying his theory is essentially this idea of the collective unifying our individual interests with the collective interests. So he says like the moral outlook of the future will be a sort of communitarianism rather than an individual rights-based moral outlook. And yeah, lots of political activists and stuff have sort of taken this line and said that we reject the bourgeois morality, but we see the future, the like seeds of a new morality of the future in the collective struggle for emancipation. So this is a key concept, like the relation between political activists in a collective struggle for the establishment of a new society and the destruction of the oppressive system in which we currently live. I don't know what else to add to that. I'd like to hear what anyone else thinks of that.
Do you want to open up the discussion now?
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously the format of this course that Woody takes the lead off, and then we just open it back up to discussion. So this can be questions, even basic questions about Marxism in general and definitional questions, but also contributions, adding to Woody's point, disagreeing of course, adding or disagreeing with each other's points. Obviously the discussion is between all of us, not just to the speaker. So yeah, has anyone got any questions or contributions?
Yeah, okay. I think, I think it's like a really like interesting point to highlight is kind of how effectively, what is a Marxist method? It is about looking at the material conditions, about dialectical materialism and seeing how they unfold. And we shouldn't take a different outlook towards morality. We have to realise that morality arises as its basis in class societies and whatnot. and that any attempts at individual universal morality are in many respects just completely flawed. I think Trotsky, I was reading one of his things on the subject beforehand, and he basically says that any thing in which you attempt to have as a universal morality ultimately ends up coming back to the idea of God. In that, and that's the only way in which people end up justifying it, because it doesn't have a basis in the ever-changing material conditions.
You could argue that now, in a kind of more secularised society, that God has been replaced by human nature, because by the same way, capitalists could quite easily argue exactly what we're arguing, that because, I hate to say it, because you guys will probably all attack me for it, but I understand Marxism not as a science, it's an understanding of human nature and how we should then structure society around it, and that's the same for capitalism. So Marxism relies on human beings being fundamentally caring and cooperative, whereas capitalism relies on humans being fundamentally aggressive and competitive. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, mate.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the idea that human nature is excluded from Marx's theory is quite a shallow view. I think it is a massive part of it, and I think that sorry, what was your?
I can't remember. I think my first bit was more about how human nature has replaced God as a justification and an explanation.
Oh yes, I was going to make a point about how human nature is specific to how humans actualize themselves throughout history. So it's it is natural, but it's also dialectic and it's progressive.
See, I suppose with regards, so I guess the one thing I guess we want to avoid, or Marxists would want to avoid, is suggesting that capitalist conception of human nature and the Marxist conception of human nature just do two possible ideals, which we could just sort of hash out. I think there's a sense in which Marx thinks that human cooperation is empirically evident if you analyse human history, and in fact, the bizarre thing is that a capitalist society is an example of this cooperation at its most extensive. I think a great deal of Marx's discussion about commodity fetishism is the idea that human social relations have been disguised by the fact that such relations appear in the form of relationships between things and their values. Nevertheless, those relations are just really human relations that have become general, impersonal and objectified, but they're nevertheless social relations. So much more Marx's point is that part of the transition from capitalism and socialism, or the transition to capitalism, is an inversion of our recognition of the social nature of our relations of production. Socialism is one that seeks to situate us that we consciously recognise the social character of production, whereas capitalism seems to disguise it.
I think one of the interesting things with the whole debates on human nature, etc., is that, ultimately, ultimately, in some respects, it can sometimes be superfluous to the analysis, in the sense that, let's assume that humans are how we find them in capitalism is their natural state. Fair enough. We naturally got here. There wasn't any divine intervention or anything like that. It seems a relatively just assumption. Well, what does that create? That creates a society where, people want to better themselves. Well, but it's in the interest of a working class to better themselves through increased wages, through higher, less working hours, etc., stuff like that. Whilst it's in the interest of the capitalist class to increase the rate of exploitation, to push down on wages, to push up working hours, to decrease working conditions, to attack benefits and whatnot. And these are both coming from the same effective impulse, you could say, of trying to actually get the best for each other, for themselves, which is based around capitalism. Has this position where you only benefit through benefit yourself compared to, let's say, more Gentile societies.
I think that's the idea of what he says about the illusion of the individual. It's the collective welfare is the individual welfare. It's there's no way of separating the two.
Well, I think again, I'm kind of thinking of shooting from the hip here, but I think in capitalism you can, obviously separate individual welfare from collective welfare. I mean, what is it's almost a definition of a capitalist in some respects, someone whose individual welfare is completely separated from society. But you notice actually only that's a very specific form of society. If you look back at, let's say, more tribal societies and stuff like that, and even societies based on slavery, actually, you see that far more people's individual welfare is far more consumed with the welfare of everyone else, on this basis that social relations were direct. If I want, let's say, more things, then I, in some respects, need my family to get more things. That's where I live. Whilst in capitalism, if I need more things, I need more money.
Right, but see, I'd maintain that again is still the situation. It's just the social nature of that relationship is disguised by money and things.
That's what I'm saying. So
it's still just as social. It just doesn't appear that way.
I suppose.
I was going to say it's still social, but it's not cooperative. There's a difference. It's more like a relationship of exploitation rather than kind of I'm doing this to help you. It's I'm doing this to help myself. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. It's certainly fundamental, like voice of character. Although I guess relations between workers might not obviously be so exploitative, even though again they're not immediately apparent. Like, I mean, it depends. But yeah, I think that would probably be right. Actually, they're not necessarily cooperative in that sense. But the element social, I suppose, would be the more.
And I think that's what I'm kind of trying to get at. The idea is that in a Gentile family-based society, you are dependent on the increasing of the community. Whilst in capitalism, that obviously isn't the case. Like capitalists get very, very rich and very, very powerful, often at the expense of everyone else. Whilst this isn't the same.
Would you not say that the capitalist has generalised their position to the whole of society? So the worker is still in a position where their interest is the collective interest. They just don't they've been blinded to that fact.
Well,
how would you mean? Explain.
So it depends on the workers not seeing themselves as a mass with a collective interest. So they're sellers of labour value. They're trying to better themselves through that. Yeah,
I think that's a good point to point out that as the worker, as an individual, as a consumer, they are very much dependent, on their own interests. It's how much they can get in a paycheck depends, and how much they can buy depends on their welfare. In a situation where as the worker, when they see themselves in a class, when they're forced to see themselves in a class through the material conditions of simply, being in the workplace, which they need to in order to survive, then their interest very much, then their interest do become, I wouldn't say the collective interest, because I'd say the class interest, in the sense that the working class still finds its opposition to the capitalists. In dispossessing the capitalists, capitalist interests are very obviously threatened. There isn't a collective interest in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, within working class. So
oh yeah.
The same as a class interest.
Yeah, so trying to kind of avoid the idea that you're pointing towards, this whole humanity. I don't think we should.
Well, again, so I think this is what's again interesting. But Marx is trying to find a practical basis to universalise the free and most intensive development of the human being.
Yeah.
To some extent. So, I mean, the bourgeois can't obviously universalise this because they necessarily must exploit independent upon the mass working class. But
despite their attempts to use it.
But the bourgeois, as becoming a working class person, can, if they, as it were, change their social position, they can find an identity.
I mean, and I think in some respects, actually, this when he edits it, he may be creating some master rap of Marx's Society remix. No, I've just got Jack saying you've got it round the wrong way. So I've click auto rotate. I'm not sure how that's coming up. It looks fine from where I'm looking at it.
Well, I get to see all the sorts of
I think I checked it. It's just they're
Ooh. It's not like it looks like Barnaby's flying off the wall. But no, what was I saying? Yeah, and I think this really highlights the important difference between a socialist society and a communist society, and why the idea of a dictatorship of a proletariat in that sense. Under socialism, we're not really trying to say that the bourgeois, their welfare anything will probably have increased. I mean, in all likelihood, the people who own the same as bomb 3.5 billion, socialism really is in no way in their interest. And maybe you could argue for an altruistic way, but even then, when you've got so much of the world's wealth, where it's going to be in your interest by maintaining that.
I did find it quite interesting though, the idea. I was like reading some stuff like, earlier today about the like basis of Marx's like moral aspects of his work in Hegel, and the idea that like the ruling class in society is sort of like removed from society, so they're not actually able to actualize themselves through interaction with society because they're not able to work. It's not in their
How do you mean?
part of their position. So they're not able to be a part of society because they hold this exclusive position.
Yeah, doesn't Marx talk about the alienation of the bourgeois? It's how they become alienated from others and sometimes they can't participate in the same way. Obviously, it's not like woe is the bourgeois, but it's kind of like there is a kind of inhumanity to being bourgeois as well. Well, I mean, obviously, your livelihood depends on the exploitation of your work.
I wouldn't say it's just the fact that like they're in a position where they're able to actualise the things the working class aren't able to actualise. They are sort of distorted in this similar opposite sense.
Yeah. No.
I mean, yeah, definitely to an extent I can kind of see that. And I remember having a quite fun discussion with a friend of mine who was bourgeois. And
He was bourgeois.
Or the multi-million billionaire.
Oh, yeah, no, he was bourgeois. Okay.
They were actually bourgeois.
You do find them sometimes.
So no, I'd say, oh, I'm middle class. And, like some people like, no, you're just like a snob. And then some people, no, you're genuine. No, you're not middle class. You're genuinely part of the establishment. It's always quite interesting. But and I mean, you get very interesting things of your life effectively becomes dedicated around to just constantly increasing the rate of exploitation. I mean, don't refer to it as that, but just making more money. I just got to constantly increase the rate of exploitation.
Exploitation.
Yeah. You'd probably always say there's that peep show thing where they go, "Are we the baddies?" But yeah, and there's definitely some woes there. But again, like, kind of just come back to the point I was on. I think I think this is kind of fundamentally different between socialism and communism in that socialism, is dictatorship proletariat in the sense that it really does say, okay, ultimately it's going to be the working class who are going to benefit from this society. The woes of the bourgeois are not woes we're particularly concerned with. Let's say, how can we? I mean, because effectively, it's often things of how can I really find meaning when I could buy anything in the world? That isn't really. I mean, there is a certain. It's far more about solving those initial things, of actually the crisis of working class. But when you start getting a communist society, when you have this abundance and complete abundance that you do, well, then actually, the questions are, well, what do I do with all this wealth, free time that I can, that kind of questions which Sartre deals with, and the existentialism and stuff like that.
The usual existential barrel of laughs.
That type of thing. But ultimately, those are situations in which a communist society could solve. But ultimately, a socialist society is for the benefit and the working class taking over to solve their needs, which are often far more of how will I get enough food, how can we actually have good services, in fact, almost very material things. Only in communism do the material conditions fade away.
But that's the argument, isn't it? That the working class are the embodiment of the future of humanity. So they're the only people who can actually actualise it.
Yeah. I mean, they're the embodiment of socialist society, because on the definition, there's a working class to take power.
But there's also a much more broader humanitarian aim that's applied by Marx, that the working class will be the real foundation for universal emancipation, insofar as they can universalise their class position without exploitation or else degrading, the development of mankind.
Yeah. Wait. Can you expand?
Obviously, Marx is not merely just sort of fetishising the working class. It's more like the working class are the only kinds of people who relate to each other on a practical basis in a way that's equitable and that pursues their collective interests. So the problem with pre-capitalist formations is they didn't have this whole capitalist problem of pursuing production for the sake of exchange, but of course they tended to exist in very narrow horizons and tend to be quite heavily controlled by various sort of dominant classes, of course, like lords and such. Capitalism, of course, opens up society to broader horizons scientifically and culturally by abolishing these sort of feudal relations, but then there's a new form of domination, which is the domination by the capitalist class. So the social society kind of, as it were, takes the best of both worlds. Production for use, but also a genuinely fairer basis for social equality.
No.
And also breaking from the parochial horizons of peasant life, or as Marx put it, the rural idiocy of peasant life.
I mean, it does sound really awful being a peasant, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, well, I think, to be fair, I think Marx is quite clear in this. He had some contempt for the limitations of antiquity. And in this case, he thought it was great, obviously, that they pursued life for itself, not money. On the other hand, they had very narrow horizons, so it didn't like the average man of that day didn't have much interest in doing much as far as Marx was concerned.
Yeah, I think that's a point to highlight. You know, I think some analysis of Marx kind of talks about the whole idea of socialism and communism. You know, everyone can almost attain the same level of basically bourgeois that we have now. You know, of great access to culture and possibilities which are currently open to the members of the ruling class. I agree that socialism does lead to socialism, that you can fade away and that you can start to overcome the material limits on life, and you can universalise this experience. But there are still, in itself, socialism still does have limitations. Mainly that we're not in a world of superabundance, in which you can't really get past that.
Cool. Any further contributions or questions?
I'd just be curious, because I've never actually read Marx, I'm really lazy, so everything I get to comes through history, which makes me act like, in defence of rural peasants, because I quite like them, and I'm doing the early modern period, and it's like everyone's really mean to them, and when the printing press came out, peasants did read. People read to each other. People wanted to learn and to improve their livelihood and their intelligence and stuff. So I don't think you can just assume somehow they're innately stupid because they live in the country. They were there's a really great book called, I think it's The Cheese and the Worms, and it's this peasant and he read loads of stuff and he came up with this mad theory that the world was a block of cheese that was being eaten by worms. And he eventually got killed by the Inquisition because everyone got really angry, so they snitched on him. But
see, that's pretty attractive.
Sorry, that's completely irrelevant. It just makes me really.
I think that's actually a fair point. I think sometimes actually, this is certainly from earlier Marx as well. I think sometimes he's unduly harsh to pre-capitalist peoples. His later views tend to be a lot more careful to not obviously these people have sophisticated cultures, for example. I think he raised that. And actually you kind of raised why I think what tends to cause their horizons to be so narrow. It's not so much them, much more the institutions that need to keep them under control. Again, domination is a way, it's how people keep getting kept down intellectually and culturally.
Also, so obviously working class is the basis for a kind of overthrow of society, and they're the universal ideal. So could you expand a bit on that, on how the working class is unified, and if we're there yet, and
I think
how to maybe?
I think the idea would be something like production in a capitalist society requires our cooperation as workers, and that roughly is the material basis. And insofar as capitalism generalises this socialised production, more people in the world become dependent upon each other in this highly socialised way, and thus advance their individual interests. They have to work with everyone else as well. It's not always been true. You probably would have had small-scale private production for a lot of human history, which meant, of course, that people related to each other in probably a lot more either competitive way or at least not an openly cooperative way, insofar as they had their own thing going on, you had your own thing going on, and they didn't need you to survive kind of situation. I suppose also the other thing as well, on the sort of point of equality, I guess I've been reading in this. My thought is the worker as an identity is quite an empty one in that sense. The only thing that unites everyone in that sense is that the way in which they labour. But to the ends to which they labour and the life which they pursue, that identity leaves that quite open. Whereas if you look at pre-capitalist identities, the Catholic serf, the feudal lord, the Protestant English middle class, these specific subjectivities that people occupy prescribe their moral, practical horizons. Whereas this is what capitalism generalizes. The consumer individual of capitalism, funnily enough, again, actually, as it were, has destroyed these prescriptive horizons insofar as it's made us all equal as consumers and nothing else. So also, capitalism has generalized this kind of openness and heterogeneity in people, but obviously has its own problems.
kind of just getting back to like kind of the main point there, the reason which, so reason again that Marx says the working class, are important. It isn't because of, again, some fetishisation, our workers, they're poor people, therefore, they should have their lot in society, that type of thing. It's they should get a chance. It's far more on the basis that because of the innate contradictions within the capitalist system, again, talked about the class divisions which arise from it, the fact that capitalists have to exploit the workers, but the fact that also all of the capitalist powers come directly from the workers. The workers are the ones who produce value in society, produce profit. And all the troubles of the capitalists in themselves come from themselves. The fact, again, and we'll get onto this next week, in the economic crises which capitalism develops, etc. And this effectively, and then there's a really great passage actually in the Communist Manifesto where Marx talks about kind of development of class consciousness. Well, okay, you start off with a few workers who link together in just a single factory, and they link together across the entire factory, and then they link together across industries, and then multiple industries, and then political parties and mass movements. Because effectively, same thing. Let's say Corbyn talked about stuff like increasing minimum wage, and that you can connect on an even wider layer. Ultimately, the widest layer is democratic control of the workplace, which all kind of workers strived for, and all capitalists strive against. And it's on this basis in which Marx sees that this revolutionary potential arises from there, because that workers are, by the very nature of work, all stuck together in increasing numbers.
But they're not, though.
But how would you say?
Well, obviously, because this is me coming from the gender perspective, the working class is from throughout most of history, and today it still tends to be divided by gender. Like, it's all well and good having unified working class, or when the factory together, let's democratically elect it, but when women are still forced to do the vast majority of domestic labour completely unpaid, and the vast majority of healthcare jobs, and then everything else, workforces themselves are gender division. I think that's something we need to bear in mind when we're talking about these things. There isn't a unified working class,
the working
especially
class.
Race as well.
Yeah, exactly. The working class is more it's subsumes these antagonisms between men and women, between races. So it's not a way to dissolve them and whitewash them.
No, I'm not trying to dissolve them. What I'm trying to say is, I think if you want to take this kind of out of a theoretical debate and put it more into practical use, you've got to take acknowledgement in particular of kind of gendered nuances, and the fact that you can't it needs to be more unified, needs to be more equal. Women need complete control over their bodies. What I'm trying to say.
Exactly. So I fully agree.
And wages for housework, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. Housework is another form of labouring, and it needs to be recognised. Exactly. But so what that would do, if